Hi, I'd like to say a few words about designing an inheritance hierarchy. Now, in order to do that, let's review why we want to use inheritance in the first place. So the first thing is co-reuse. If there are two types or more that actually share a lot of common characteristics and common implementation, then we can put the common code between them in a parent class so that we don't have to copy and paste code between these types, right? So that's the first reason we want to use inheritance code reuse. And then also at the same time, if the common behavior change, then we can just make the modification in one place rather than replicate the same change as the same changes everywhere, right? So that's another benefit. And then finally, we want to have a sensible organization of informations, and in this case, it's the types. So it's important that we design a good inheritance hierarchy uh, such that all of these goals are achieved before we start to write any code. Now, obviously, it's not possible to always get things right the very first time, but it's still very important that we think things through, do a design on paper before we dive into the code. So this is the inheritance hierarchy that we've been using throughout our discussion of inheritance. Now, it's very simplistic. So, in an actual project or in the real world, any sort of inheritance hierarchy can be very, very complex. So let's now look at something just slightly more complex, but it's still very simple inheritance hierarchy of animals. Now, this is a view of the classification of animals. So that you might have seen in like high school biology or something like that. So at the top is just the animals, right? So it includes all the animals in the world. And then in animals, they can be divided into vertebrates and invertebrates, and then vertebrates can be further divided into kind of reptiles, fish, etc., etc., and then same for the invertebrates. Now, this classification, if you think about it, well, it really can be a model for a inheritance hierarchy, right? If we want to design types that represent different types of animal, but in a programming language like Python, we can really kind of build up classes more or less like what this shows us. So let's see how that can be done. Now, again, for the purpose of discussion, I'm going to have very small number of animals. It's not necessary that we have something very complex to kind of illustrate my point. So here it is. We have just four animals: dog, duck, cricket, and bee. And then for each of the animals, the only two pieces of information we're keeping is whether it has backbones or not, and this kind of sound that this particular animal makes. Now, they are all animals, so we can just create a simple one base class animals and have all of these different animals inherit from the base animal class. Now, that's simple, that works, but if you look at this a little more carefully, you see that some of these animals do share some similar characteristics. Like like dog and duck, they both have backbones, and cricket and bee, neither of them have backbones. So, and going back to the goal of one of the major goal of uh, inheritance is such that similar characteristics or similar code, similar attributes, they can be reused. So, but in this particular inheritance hierarchy, those similar characteristics, they live in separate um, types. So we are not designing the best, most efficient inheritance hierarchy to facilitate information or code we used. Right? So how can we do better? So one way, just like in the real classification of animals, is to have dog and Doug, both of which have backbones, to inherit from a new vertebrate class. And the common characteristic for vertebrates, obviously, is that they all have backbones, right? And the same thing for cricket and bees. Neither of them have backbones, so we can introduce an intermediate class between them and animal called invertebrate, which um, says that whatever any animal that inherits from invertebrate have no backbones, and in such case, the backbone information no longer have to live inside these animals at the bottom, and they can be pushed up to vertebrate and invertebrate, and just by inheriting from them, these animals have the backbone information. So this is an example of reusing or sharing information between different types or classes. Now, in this particular inheritance hierarchy, we have 3 levels, and obviously we're not limited to 3 levels, and we can have more if it makes sense. But at the same time, it probably shouldn't have like 20, 50 levels, just depending on the problem you're trying to solve, come up with a solution or a design that just makes sense. Now, if you look at the real animal hierarchy, it has actually 7 levels, and it's a pretty big tree, right? And the design of that, I guess they make sense to biology based on whatever information they have. Whether you're classifying animals or designing a inheritance hierarchy for animals in Python code, they what they do share the same kind of feature, that at the top of the hierarchy or classification tree, that it's usually something very general, like animals or invertebrates. Up here, they're very general. It contains very few pieces of information, and it can contain many different types of things, right? And as you go down the inheritance hierarchy, things are getting more and more specific because they inherit characteristic from the whatever the type above them. So it gets more and more specific until it gets to the very last level in this inheritance hierarchy, or again classification trees, and then that's a very specific type at the bottom that has very, very specific information and potentially a lot of information about that particular type. And inheritance is used throughout Python, the language itself. So another example that you can look at is actually all the exceptions. There are many different exceptions in Python, and they are in an inheritance hierarchy. So here's a link to it, and it's interesting to see how they organize all the different exceptions.